My name is Nancy Dixon, and I'm the editor of NO Lit, 200 Years of New Orleans Literature. I've lived in New Orleans for 40 years, so I started studying New Orleans literature in a roundabout way, about the 7th time in Central Lockup. Well, when I said that about Central Lockup, I was partly serious because so many New Orleans writers were of the unsavory sort, and even ran into trouble while they were here. And as many of us know, many of us lovers of New Orleans literature and readers of New Orleans literature, and citizens of New Orleans know that it's easy to run into trouble in this city. But that's also what makes this city, the excitement, let's call it, of this city makes it a fun city to write about. And that's from the first. The earliest literature was, I chose 200 years because I wanted to start when New Orleans was under American rule for the first time. And the oldest extant play that we have performed in New Orleans literature, it's in the book, is The Heroism of Puchahuma. And it's about war among the Native Americans that we proceeded to oust once the Western settlers got here. But the early literature was about war. And was about, the very first play has two young Indian braves getting drunk, and one murders the other. Then you look some almost 200 years later, and you have Tom Dent's play Ritual Murder, with two young friends, two young African American men after work getting drunk in the Bywater, or actually not the Bywater, in the Ninth Ward, and one of them stabs his best friend and murders him. So there's this excitement, even criminality, that's and violence that runs throughout a lot of the literature of the city. Violence, alcoholism, and alcohol use among the writers, among the characters in the works. Naturally, love and betrayal, but New Orleans also has some kinky subjects. In Lyle Saxon's A Centaur Plays Croquet, a young newlywed bride falls in love with a centaur because he's everything that centaurs are supposed to be, virile and sexy, and her husband is just doesn't know what to do, so they sort of try and make it a threesome for a while. It's a very strange.
Is that Uptown?
Actually, it's on a plantation out of town. But it's funny you say, is it uptown? Not a whole lot of the stories do take place uptown. Most of them take place in the French Quarter, actually. I mean, some of them do, of course, but most of them take place in the French Quarter.
Care to speculate?
Well, of course, when the city began 200 years ago, the French Quarter was the city, and then also the French Quarter. I mean, it's still where we come downtown, where there's the French Quarter, the Marigny, the Bywater. We come downtown to have fun. I mean, as a rule. That's the Tennessee Williams Festival is downtown. All literary festivals are downtown. We come downtown a lot. Some of my favorite bars are downtown. Two Jacks, the bar downstairs, the Carousel Bar. And this is the center of the action of the city, and it really was for 150 years or so. Now we got the hipsters making the Bywater all groovy. What I call the golden age of New Orleans literature, I see as post-Reconstruction New Orleans. But then again, I talked to Susan Larson, and she sees it like sort of the 1960s New Orleans, with Susan Lehman and John Kennedy Toole and Walker Percy, and there's an argument for both. But I think that what I'm talking about is the first time that New Orleans literature came into its own, and so I'll say that mine's in the fin de siècle, and hers is in the 20th century. But I think that that's when literature changed, like the literature of the American Renaissance. That's when, like I said, it came into its own. People started reading New Orleans writers because New Orleans writers were good, not just because they wanted to see something cute about New Orleans. But then we also had we had the then hipsters coming down here. We had Sherwood Anderson. We had William Faulkner. We had Elma Godchaux. We had Ham Basso. I mean, he didn't come down here. He lived here. But we had a whole group of hipsters that did come down here. Elma Godchaux was from here, too. They came down here to write. We kind of have that same influx now. Maybe we'll get some a nice creative wave out of that, too. Initially, this book did come into my mind because I taught New Orleans literature for so long that every time I did, we had to cobble together a course online, on the internet. I had to find something here because books were out of print. I had to Xerox this and Xerox that, post this on Blackboard. And finally I said, I'm getting really tired of this. Why don't I just write the damn book? And then I can use it in my class. It would be way easier, and I can maybe make some money on it. And so I decided to do it on my sabbatical, and I applied for a sabbatical for a whole different reason. But I thought this would make a better project. I said I'll just get a grant and I'll finish it in a year and a half. And 5 years later, here it is. It was the most tedious process. Besides, I had to read everything. I mean, I was real familiar with New Orleans lit. I'd been reading it for a long time, but I had to read everything. And that was difficult. Then I've made the parameters, and that helped a little bit. But then acquiring the rights was a really arduous task, as my publisher can tell you. And the living and recently dead were some of the most difficult writers to work with. Most of the writers, all of the writers in here were gracious. There was only one that we could not track down, and that was Lillian Hellman's Toys in the Attic. We never could find the permissions for it, or even how to go about finding the permissions for it. I think that's a big mistake, not having it in here, but it's 560 pages. I'm glad we couldn't find it in the end, because it would have been too long. It would take just what it took here. It would take writing about New Orleans. It would take living in New Orleans, or at least spending some time here. And it would take, not every story is necessarily set in New Orleans, but most of them are. And it would take something that showed some sort of sense of, I don't know if it's the area that I mean, or maybe the atmosphere of the area, and not necessarily this one. And maybe something to do with the legacy of writers that's come before them. Some sort of connection.